The first few minutes after waking are a critical window for influencing your brain and overall mental state. Upon waking, your brain transitions from a sleep state dominated by slow, wave or RAM activity into a more alert, receptive state governed by the interaction of several neurochemicals. Among the most important of these is cortisol, which naturally peaks 30 to 60 minutes after you open your eyes. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's part of the body's circadian rhythm, helping you become alert and ready for the day. But what you do with this heightened cortisol state has powerful implications. During this time, your nervous system is especially sensitive to input, meaning that what you expose yourself to, thoughts, words, light, movement, has a disproportionate impact on your brain's functioning and structure. This makes morning self-talk a potent lever for shaping neural pathways. You might think of thoughts as fleeting, intangible things, but in the context of neuroscience, repeated thoughts are experiences, and experiences are what drive neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change and adapt in response to what it encounters. When you say something to yourself in the morning, especially when said out loud and with emotional engagement, you're not just being motivational, you're physically altering the strength and architecture of your brain circuits. For example, consider the phrase, "I am in control of where I place my attention." When you say this to yourself every morning, you engage the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for executive functions like decision-making, planning, and attentional control. You're not just mentally affirming a belief. You're activating a specific neural network that governs focus. The more frequently you do this, the more that network is reinforced through synaptic strengthening. This is Hebbian learning in action. Neurons that fire together, wire together. Over time, your baseline ability to resist distraction and sustain concentration improves, not because of willpower alone, but because you've literally built the neural circuits that support that ability. Moreover, the early morning is a time when your internal environment is relatively undisturbed by external input. Before you pick up your phone or engage with the demands of the world, your mind is in a relatively clean state, a blank canvas, neurologically speaking. This is an ideal condition for top-down regulation of the brain. Top-down processing is when higher cognitive functions, like intention and reasoning, guide your perception and behavior, as opposed to bottom-up processing, where your attention is hijacked by external stimuli. By deliberately engaging in focused, self-directed morning dialogue, you're reinforcing the dominance of top-down mechanisms. This enhances your ability to self-regulate throughout the rest of the day. It's important to understand that this isn't about reciting feel-good phrases or false optimism. It's about strategic mental conditioning. Repeated verbalizations in the morning can become automatic mental scripts, internal patterns of thought that operate beneath your awareness and influence your moment-to-moment behavior. Over weeks and months, these scripts can override older, less adaptive patterns of thought that might have been shaped by stress, trauma, or randomness. And this kind of reprogramming is most effectively initiated during periods of high neuroplasticity, like the early morning cortisol window. Additionally, a morning self-talk has downstream effects on your autonomic nervous system. Positive, empowering statements can reduce activity in the sympathetic nervous system, the system responsible for the fight or flight response, and increase parasympathetic tone, which promotes calmness, digestion, and recovery. This doesn't mean you eliminate stress. Some stress is adaptive and necessary, but it helps your body respond to stress with balance and resilience rather than overwhelm and burnout. There's also a reinforcing loop at play here. When you consistently say things that focus your attention, affirm your capacity to act, and emphasize progress over perfection, you begin to perceive more evidence in your environment that those things are true. This is known as attentional bias. The brain begins to selectively filter and prioritize information that aligns with your dominant internal narrative. That means the more you affirm that you are capable and intentional, the more your brain will notice opportunities to act with capability and intention. This further strengthens those neural circuits, creating a self-reinforcing loop of motivation, focus, and behavioral alignment. It's not magic, it's neurology. The act of speaking to yourself in the morning, especially with repetition and emotional engagement, is a scientifically grounded tool for sculpting the mind. It's a way to deliberately encode new patterns into your neural networks right at the time when your brain is most primed to receive and reinforce them. In short, the few minutes after waking are not trivial. They are a neurobiological gateway, a brief but potent period where self-directed thoughts can become deeply embedded traits. If you want to change the way your brain operates, the best time to start is when you open your eyes. And the best method is intentional, structured, and empowering internal dialogue. What you say to yourself in the morning isn't just the start of your day. It's the start of your transformation. Cortisol, often labeled as the stress hormone, is frequently misunderstood. While high levels of cortisol associated with chronic stress can have negative consequences, its natural, rhythmic release in the body, especially in the early morning, is not only healthy, but vital. In fact, this early morning cortisol peak plays a key role in helping you wake up, become alert, and orient your brain and body toward the demands of the day. What many people don't realize is that this period also represents a unique window of heightened brain plasticity, making it an ideal time to introduce purposeful thoughts and behaviors that can shape how your brain functions over time. Every 24-hour cycle, your body follows a circadian rhythm, a biological clock influenced by light, temperature, and internal cues. One of the first things that happens upon waking is a sharp increase in cortisol levels, referred to as the cortisol awakening response. This surge helps raise blood sugar levels slightly, mobilize energy, and prepare the brain for action. But what's particularly interesting from a neuroscience standpoint is that cortisol also modulates the activity of the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex, two regions deeply involved in memory, attention, and decision-making. When cortisol is naturally elevated during this early window, the brain becomes more receptive to new inputs and more capable of forming and reinforcing new connections. In short, your brain is in a chemically optimized state to learn and adapt. The implications of this are profound. If during this window, you flood your system with reactive behavior, checking social media, reading stressful news, or engaging in mindless distraction, you are essentially training your brain to begin the day in a reactive, scattered, and externally driven state. The circuits involved in stress reactivity, fear, and impulsivity become more engaged. Over time, this creates a baseline of mental activity that is more vulnerable to anxiety, poor focus, and burnout. But the reverse is also true. If you use this morning window to introduce deliberate, empowering language, what you might call structured self-talk, you are training your brain to organize itself around focus, purpose, and internal control. When you repeat a thought like, effort is the path to reward, during this cortisol peak, you aren't just speaking to yourself. You are programming your reward system. This phrase reinforces the idea that motivation and satisfaction do not come from achieving an outcome alone, but from engaging in the process itself. This engages the mesolimbic dopamine system, which is responsible for motivation, effort valuation, and the anticipation of future rewards. The act of tying reward to effort rather than to outcomes has tremendous neurobiological advantages. Dopamine, the primary neuromodulator involved in drive and persistence, is more sustainably released when it is linked to behaviors within your control, like showing up, applying focus, and persisting through discomfort. If dopamine is tied only to external rewards, it becomes harder to maintain motivation when those rewards are delayed or uncertain. But when dopamine is anchored to the process, the pursuit itself becomes reinforcing. This means that each step you take, each small act of discipline, triggers a chemical feedback loop that fuels further effort. The morning cortisol peak amplifies this process. Neurologically, the brain is looking for signals to guide the day's behavior. What to pay attention to, what to avoid, what to pursue. When you inject it with self-directed thoughts that align effort with meaning, the brain integrates these as core instructions. It's almost as if you're giving your brain a manual. Here is how I want to function today. And because of the brain's plasticity in this early state, those instructions are far more likely to be encoded deeply and persistently. Furthermore, this practice of morning self-talk paired with the cortisol peak has long-term implications for emotional regulation and stress resilience. When you habitually tell yourself that effort is worthwhile, you are preloading your brain with a lens through which to interpret difficulty. Stressful moments no longer feel like personal failures or insurmountable obstacles. They become expected and valuable parts of the growth process. This changes the way your amygdala and anterior cingulate cortex interpret adversity, leading to a more measured and adaptive physiological response to stress. You're not suppressing stress, you're reshaping your relationship with it. What makes all of this powerful is that it's accessible to anyone. You don't need expensive tools, apps, or complex routines. All you need is awareness of the opportunity that exists in those first moments of the day and a willingness to speak with purpose. You are quite literally teaching your brain what to value, what to pursue, and how to behave, starting from the inside out. So when you wake up tomorrow, remember that your brain is listening. The window is open. The neurochemistry is active. And what you say to yourself in those moments isn't just mental noise, it's instruction. It's a map. And if you choose to tell yourself that effort is meaningful, that growth happens through action, and that progress is its own reward, you are laying down the neurological pathways that make those truths more than just beliefs. They become your biology. Neuroplasticity is the brain's remarkable ability to change its structure and function based on experience. This concept, while widely understood today, is deeply influenced by one key principle used: dependent plasticity. In simple terms, the brain strengthens the connections and networks that are used repeatedly and weakens those that are not. This means the thoughts you consistently have, the actions you consistently take, and the emotional states you consistently return to are literally sculpting your brain over time. When it comes to internal dialogue, what you say to yourself, this concept becomes incredibly powerful, especially in the context of morning routines, where your brain is most receptive to forming new patterns. Consider how often we unconsciously repeat self-limiting thoughts such as, "I can't handle this," or "I'm not good enough." These statements may seem like harmless internal chatter, but to the brain, they are inputs. Every time these thoughts are repeated, the neural circuits associated with doubt, anxiety, and avoidance become stronger. Over weeks, months, and years, those circuits become default pathways, meaning that your brain becomes more likely to return to those patterns automatically, even when they no longer serve you. This is why changing your self-talk, especially at the start of the day when the brain is highly plastic, can be so transformative. It is an opportunity to train your mind like you would train a muscle deliberately and consistently. When you deliberately say, "Today, I will lean into discomfort with purpose," you are doing much more than just motivating yourself. You are actively reshaping the brain's response to stress and uncertainty. Discomfort naturally activates the brain's threat detection systems, particularly the amygdala, which is responsible for triggering the fight or flight response. In the absence of context, discomfort feels threatening. But when you add meaning, when you tell yourself that discomfort is purposeful, that it leads to growth, you activate the prefrontal cortex, which begins to regulate and reframe the emotional response. The same discomfort that once triggered avoidance now becomes a signal for engagement. This is a neurological shift. Instead of merely reacting to stress with resistance or fear, your brain starts to interpret discomfort as an invitation to grow. And because neuroplasticity is use-dependent, each time you engage discomfort purposefully, you are reinforcing that pattern. The brain learns discomfort equals progress. Over time, this builds resilience. Not as a vague personality trait, but as a functional biological pattern, an actual circuit that governs how you think, feel, and act in the face of challenge. Importantly, leaning into discomfort doesn't mean pushing yourself recklessly or ignoring your limits. It means recognizing that the boundary between comfort and growth is where the most potent rewiring occurs. This is known in neuroscience as the optimal stress zone or Goldilocks zone. Not too easy, not too overwhelming. Just enough challenge to require adaptation, but not so much that it leads to shutdown. When you consistently approach this zone with intention, your brain adapts not just by becoming more capable, but by becoming more confident in its capacity to adapt. This is what builds true mental toughness. Not pretending discomfort doesn't exist, but proving to yourself repeatedly that you can face it and come through the other side stronger. There is also a reinforcing feedback loop that takes place here. When you lean into discomfort and find even a small success, a task completed, a difficult conversation had, a workout pushed through, you receive a surge of dopamine. Dopamine is not just about pleasure, it's about reinforcement. It tells the brain, this was worth it. Do it again. This creates a motivational spiral where effort reinforces more effort and challenge becomes something your brain actively seeks out instead of avoids. The more you engage in this loop, the more robust and automatic it becomes. Morning is the ideal time to establish this pattern. The brain's early day chemistry, which includes elevated cortisol and heightened norepinephrine, creates a state of alertness and learning readiness. When you introduce intentional thoughts like, I lean into discomfort with purpose, you're programming your brain for the day ahead. You're giving it a lens through which to interpret stress not as a problem, but as a process. And because you're doing this consistently, every morning you are engaging use dependent plasticity. You're rehearsing a mental skill that will eventually operate below the level of conscious thought. This is not about simply feeling better. It's about functioning better. It's about building a mind that is not derailed by difficulty, but shaped by it. Each time you lean into discomfort rather than avoid it, you teach your nervous system something invaluable, that you are capable of adaptation, that growth is not just possible, but inevitable when pursued with intention, and that your internal dialogue is not just commentary, it is instruction. Through repeated use, it becomes your brain's default mode, your operating system. In this way, use dependent plasticity gives you not just the possibility, but the responsibility to shape who you become. You are not at the mercy of automatic thoughts or reactive patterns. You are the sculptor, and the morning is your chisel. And each purposeful statement you repeat, especially those rooted in embracing challenge, is a strike that refines the mind and strengthens the self. The way we feel, think, and act on a daily basis is not only a reflection of who we are, but also of the physiological and psychological state we are in at any given moment. In neuroscience, there's a critical distinction between state and trait. A state is a temporary mode, your mood, focus level, or energy at a certain point in time, while a trait is a more stable, enduring characteristic, like being generally disciplined, optimistic, or resilient. What's crucial to understand is that repeated states over time become traits. This concept is a central idea in behavioral neuroscience and psychology, and it is incredibly empowering. It means that who you become is directly influenced by how you routinely prime your internal state, especially at key times of day, like the morning. Each morning, your brain and body reset in a way that gives you a fresh opportunity to influence your baseline state. When you first wake up, your system moves from a low arousal, slow wave sleep condition into a heightened state of alertness. This shift involves an uptick in several neuromodulators, such as cortisol, norepinephrine, and acetylcholine, all of which influence attention, motivation, and memory formation. During this transitional window, your nervous system is especially sensitive to cues, including internal cues like thoughts and affirmations. If you deliberately guide your state in the morning by using language, breath, posture, and intention, you are more likely to carry those same emotional and cognitive patterns into the rest of your day. And when this becomes a daily ritual, those patterns begin to crystallize into traits. For example, if you wake up and tell yourself, I have the tools I need to adapt and grow, you are activating a mental state of confidence and capability. That single sentence may seem simple, but when it is spoken with sincerity and regularity, it becomes a form of mental rehearsal. This type of rehearsal engages the prefrontal cortex, which is the seat of decision-making and emotional regulation. It tells your brain to start scanning for evidence that you are in control, that you are capable, and that you are adaptable. Over time, this creates a bias toward self-efficacy, the belief that you can influence the outcomes in your life through your actions. This belief isn't abstract. It has a direct impact on your physiological stress response and your willingness to take on challenges. Repeated activation of such a state helps you build what psychologists call an internal locus of control. People with an internal locus of control believe their actions make a difference. Neuroscientifically, this mindset is associated with lower levels of anxiety and depression, greater persistence in the face of adversity, and increased engagement with goal-directed behavior. The opposite, an external locus of control, leaves people feeling helpless, reactive, and overwhelmed, especially when facing uncertainty or pressure. And while personality traits do play a role in this disposition, what's often overlooked is that the brain learns. It learns from repetition. So if every morning you wake up and affirm your capacity to adapt and grow, You are guiding your state in a direction that over time becomes a trait. The same is true for your physiological state. When you pair your internal dialogue with calm, controlled breathing, or with movement and posture that signals alertness and readiness, you are aligning both body and mind. This is not psychological fluff. It is rooted in the mechanics of the autonomic nervous system. Intentional breathing, for instance, influences the vagus nerve, which plays a central role in parasympathetic tone. When the body feels safe and capable, the mind follows. And when the mind adopts a narrative of strength and flexibility, the body begins to organize itself accordingly. This directional relationship between state and physiology is what allows us to condition ourselves deliberately. There's also a memory component at play. The hippocampus, a brain structure involved in forming new memories, is particularly sensitive to emotionally charged experiences. When you speak to yourself with conviction and clarity in the morning, especially while in a heightened neurochemical state, those experiences are more likely to be remembered and used as reference points later in the day. This means the statements you repeat each morning don't just shape how you feel in that moment. They shape how you respond when stress arises, when obstacles appear, or when decisions need to be made. Your brain references your internal narrative from the morning to determine how to interpret and react to situations. Through this process, your morning state becomes the foundation upon which your daily actions are built. When repeated consistently, these actions become patterns. And over time, these patterns shape traits. The person who routinely starts the day with intentional, empowering thoughts and behaviors becomes the person who is naturally focused, resilient, and driven, not because they were born that way, but because they train their system that way. The morning, then, is not just a routine transition from sleep to wakefulness. It is a neurological opportunity. It is a brief yet potent window in which you can deliberately set your internal state and, through repetition, sculpt your character. Every thought, every breath, every choice during this time contributes to the kind of person you are becoming. So when you say, "I have the tools I need to adapt and grow," you are not just affirming something for the day. You are laying down the neural architecture for a long-term trait of adaptability and growth orientation. This is how states become traits through repetition, intention, and consistency. The way we speak to ourselves is not merely a form of inner commentary. It is a powerful mechanism that engages specific neural circuits and influences both behavior and biology. The brain doesn't simply process language at a cognitive level, it responds to it physiologically. This is particularly true when it comes to statements that are clear, emotionally salient, and repeated consistently over time. What you say to yourself each morning can set a neurological tone for your entire day. And when practiced with intention, this internal language acts as a kind of training signal for your nervous system. Among the most impactful phrases you can repeat daily is a simple but profound affirmation: "I am not controlled by fear. I am guided by clarity and action." This is not just a motivational statement, it is a neurological intervention. Fear, in the context of brain function, originates in a network of regions, including the amygdala, the hypothalamus, and parts of the brainstem. This fear circuitry evolved to protect us from immediate threats, such as predators or environmental dangers. However, in modern life, these same circuits can become chronically activated by psychological stress, deadlines, social pressure, financial concerns, or uncertainty about the future. When this system is activated without resolution, it can lead to a persistent state of hypervigilance, anxiety, and behavioral paralysis. It narrows your perception, limits your options, and undermines your ability to take clear and deliberate action. But the good news is that these systems are highly responsive to cognitive input, especially input that is repeated with emotional engagement and consistency. When you affirm to yourself that you are not controlled by fear, you are directly influencing the top-down regulation of this fear circuitry. The prefrontal cortex, which is involved in higher-order thinking and decision-making, has the capacity to modulate the amygdala through inhibitory control. This means that clear, intentional thoughts can reduce the reactivity of fear responses. Saying, "I am guided by clarity and action," is not an act of denial. It is a reorientation of the brain's threat assessment system. It communicates to your nervous system that fear may be present, but it does not dictate your behavior. This is a key distinction. You are not attempting to eliminate fear, but rather to redefine its role. Fear becomes a signal, not a steering wheel. This process also activates the brain salience network, which determines what information is most relevant at any given moment. When you deliberately shift your internal dialogue from fear-based thinking to action-oriented thinking, the salience network recalibrates. Suddenly, the things you need to do: make a decision, start a project, have a difficult conversation, rise to the forefront of your mental landscape. You become less distracted by hypothetical worries and more anchored in tangible steps. This is a shift from rumination to execution, and it changes the entire tone of your day. From a behavioral neuroscience perspective, repeated activation of this pathway strengthens it. Each time you respond to fear with clarity and action, you reinforce a neural loop that favors prefrontal engagement over amygdala dominance. This is a trainable response. It becomes easier over time. What starts as a conscious choice becomes a subconscious tendency. You begin to notice that even when anxiety arises, you have a kind of cognitive buffer, a moment of pause where you choose to act based on values and priorities rather than emotional noise. This is one of the hallmarks of psychological resilience. There's also a dopamine component to this process. Dopamine is often associated with reward, but it is more accurately linked to the anticipation of reward and the motivation to pursue goals. When you shift from fear to action, even in small ways, you trigger a sense of agency. You create forward movement. This movement itself is rewarded by dopamine release, which reinforces the behavior and makes it more likely to occur again. This is critical. Action dispels fear, not just emotionally, but biochemically. The act of moving forward, despite discomfort, changes your brain's chemistry and increases your capacity for further action. It's important to understand that this isn't about pretending fear doesn't exist. It's about leveraging the plasticity of your brain to build a new default, one that is less reactive and more intentional. The morning is the ideal time to begin this process because your brain is transitioning from a state of rest into a state of readiness. The neurochemicals present during this time, cortisol, norepinephrine, and others, create a window of heightened receptivity. When you introduce a strong, directive statement during this period, such as, "I am not controlled by fear, I am guided by clarity and action," you are essentially programming your nervous system with a behavioral blueprint. Over time, this daily practice becomes more than just mental preparation. It becomes a sculpting process, reshaping your neural pathways, reconfiguring your emotional responses, and rebuilding your behavioral defaults. The brain adapts to what it does repeatedly. So if each morning you choose clarity over chaos, action over avoidance, you are building a self that naturally moves forward even in the face of challenge. You're not just setting an intention, you're changing your brain. Every morning offers a neurological and psychological reset, an opportunity to align your thoughts, behavior, and physiology toward a direction of growth. The phrase, "Today is a new opportunity to direct my mind and shape my reality," encapsulates a fundamental truth rooted in neurobiology that our brains are not static. They are continuously adapting to experience, and the quality of our thoughts and actions plays a critical role in shaping the brain's architecture. The human brain, through the mechanism of neuroplasticity, is constantly remodeling itself based on what we focus on, what we repeat, and how we respond to our internal and external environments. Therefore, the way you begin your day, the mindset you choose to adopt, has a direct influence on how your brain wires itself for future performance, emotional regulation, and resilience. When you wake up in the morning, your brain is in a highly receptive state. Levels of neurochemicals, such as cortisol, are naturally elevated during this early window, increasing alertness and readiness for learning. Cortisol, often misunderstood as simply a stress hormone, is also a key player in setting circadian rhythms and facilitating the brain's capacity for plastic change. This makes the first moments of the day an ideal time to introduce intentional thoughts, particularly those that prime your system for agency, direction, and purposeful engagement. Telling yourself that the day is a new opportunity is not simply a motivational phrase. It is a way of directing your attention. One of the brain's most valuable currencies. Attention determines what information the brain encodes and what neural networks are strengthened. By saying, "I can shape my reality," you are initiating a shift in cognitive framing. Instead of passively reacting to circumstances, you are activating what psychologists refer to as an internal locus of control, the belief that your thoughts and actions influence outcomes. Neuroscientifically, this orientation activates the prefrontal cortex, which governs executive function, goal-directed behavior, and impulse regulation. This shift does not guarantee control over external events, but it strengthens the circuits responsible for adaptive internal response. In other words, while you can't dictate what the world does, you can shape how your mind interprets and responds to it. And over time, this internal direction changes everything. The power of repetition cannot be overstated here. The circuits in the brain that govern thought patterns and behavior are governed by Hebbian plasticity. The idea that neurons that fire together wire together. This means that what you say to yourself each morning, especially if it is repeated with intention and emotion, creates a more likely pattern of thought and action for the rest of the day. These micro decisions, shaped by morning intention, compound over time. Each day you reinforce a mindset of agency and growth. You are solidifying neural networks that support resilience, focus, and adaptability. Shaping your reality does not mean ignoring the constraints or challenges you face. It means training your brain to approach those constraints with creativity and endurance. Reality is not simply what happens to you. It is how your nervous system interprets and responds to what happens. This is why directing your mind in the morning matters so much. It gives your nervous system a reference point, a directive that influences perception, decision-making, and emotional tone. When you consistently tell yourself that you have the capacity to influence your direction, the brain responds by prioritizing pathways related to effort, problem-solving, and self-efficacy. This happens both consciously and subconsciously. It's also important to recognize the role of emotion in shaping reality. Emotions color perception and influence memory consolidation. If you approach your day with dread or pessimism, the brain will interpret neutral or ambiguous events as threats, reinforcing a negative worldview. But if you begin your day with a deliberate emotional tone, grounded in curiosity, hope, or determination, you shift the brain's predictive coding toward opportunity rather than danger. This is not blind optimism. It's a form of mental conditioning. And like physical conditioning, it requires consistency. This morning affirmation then becomes more than just a tool for momentary motivation. It becomes a ritual that gradually reshapes your baseline state. Through daily practice, your baseline shifts from one of reactivity and resistance to one of clarity and intentionality. You begin to see possibilities where others see problems. You start to regulate your emotional responses not by suppressing them, but by directing them toward constructive outcomes. This shift is measurable in both behavior and brain function. Over time, you find that your mind automatically filters experience through a lens of agency and growth, not because you forced it, but because you trained it. In this way, every morning is not just a continuation of yesterday. It is a neurological opportunity to redirect the course of your thinking, to practice shaping the lens through which you experience life, and to actively participate in the construction of your reality. The brain follows your focus, and your focus begins with intention. So when you say, "Today is a new opportunity to direct my mind and shape my reality," you are not reciting a cliché. You are issuing instructions to your brain, engaging its plastic potential, and laying down the mental architecture of a more deliberate, capable, and resilient self.